Hello, YouTubers. Before I begin, it needs to be pointed out that if you're like me, you're a Trump supporter that loves God and your country. Realize that people like us are hated by many of our fellow Americans. Many of those that hate us are currently a part of the progressive movement in the Democratic Party. But do not assume that all progressives hate you, nor assume that the progressive movement is against God. The current progressive movement that exists in the Democratic Party is against God. Keep in mind, the progressive movement was started by Christians in the Republican Party, only later to be taken over by atheistic secular humanism. Because of the shift towards secular humanism, there are huge differences between the original progressive movement and the modern progressive movement. Today, I will make the case that the original progressive movement is the message for the modern Republican Party. If you're a conservative and wonder how I can make such an argument, well, for one, it's a message that unites the Republican Party with Donald Trump. Ideologically, however, I ask, what does it mean to be a conservative? I suggest that, much as the progressive movement has done, that the definition of American conservatism be updated to better reflect the root word. The original meaning of progressive meant the opposite of laissez-faire. However, modern progressives define progressivism as meaning to bring about progress. And since the base of the Republican Party has dramatically changed, the Republican Party also needs to update the definition of being a conservative. Conservatism should mean to conserve the culture and values that turned America into the greatest nation in the world. This definition much better reflects all wings of the Republican Party, yet makes a clear distinction between Republicans and Democrats. That Republicans love what America once was and can be again, while Democrats love what they believe America should be. I suspect many Republicans already understand conservatism in this manner. The true beauty of this definition is that it directly unties conservatism from laissez-faire and allows for a broad range of policies pertinent to the situation. By highlighting some of the policies of Trump and his supporters, I'll show how Trump is the first right-wing progressive since Teddy Roosevelt. In so doing, it should also show how the early progressive movement is far different than the one that currently exists in the Democratic Party. It can't be understated how good a rise in right-wing progressivism is for not only the Republican Party, but America. There's a reason Teddy Roosevelt is on Mount Rushmore after all, and he's the most popular president we've ever had. So I say that Republicans reclaim the original progressive movement as it appears Donald Trump has started to do, though in some ways this actually started within the party before Trump. If you're familiar with politics, the only ones that practice anything close to laissez-faire is the libertarian wing of the party, people like Ron Paul. And while other Republicans want to conserve the same culture and values, they do not advocate for laissez-faire policy to accomplish it. For example, there's nothing laissez-faire about being pro-life. Even the pro-life libertarians advocate for federal involvement, albeit less involvement. For example, Ron Paul's policy on abortion is essentially to have the federal government define abortion as murder so that the states can prosecute abortion as murder. Even if you're pro-life like me, I'm betting you think that's a pretty terrible idea. Being pro-life is a right-wing progressive policy, at least under the laissez-faire understanding of conservatism. A laissez-faire policy would be exactly what the so-called progressives on the left advocate for, that the government not get involved. The difference is not over the power of the federal government, but over the issue of morality. Whether on the right or left, progressives seek to transform the morality of society, and there is agreement on many of these issues. For example, the greed of corporations. On the issue of abortion, of course, there is disagreement. Those on the right tend to find abortion immoral, while those on the left do not. Because left-wingers do not view it as immoral, they will say it's not progressive. But consider that if the goal is to reduce or prohibit abortion, policy is implemented that successfully does that, then it is progressive since progress occurs. Republicans are trying to conserve the morality our society once had, or, if you will, to progress us into becoming a more moral society. As already noted, one of the biggest differences between the early progressive movement of the Republican Party and the current progressive movement in the Democratic Party is that the early progressive movement was a very pro-Christian movement. In fact, the earliest beginnings of the progressive movement were in the churches of what we would today identify as evangelical or charismatic Christians, through what was called the social gospel. Hopefully, I'm also showing how a new rise in right-wing progressivism is also very pro-Christianity. How did the progressive movement transform into the atheistic secular movement that it is today? I might make a more detailed video about that sometime, but the long and short of it is that the message became so powerful and popular that many secularists started to join. When there were more secularists than Christians, the progressive movement began to push for the same values but without the Christianity, what was called secular humanism. Since then, the movement has deviated far from the original message. In another difference, earlier progressive movements did not practice identity politics as the current left-wing progressive movement does. It's identity politics, more than anything, that divides our nation. Republicans are wise enough to understand that identity politics is a form of racism or sexism. The only thing that could possibly be construed as identity politics in the early progressive movement was women's suffrage, but that wasn't identity politics. It was just the recognition that since women are human beings, they have the right to vote. It's easy to see how racist or sexist identity politics is by answering these simple questions. Does a person have any rights because they're black? Does a person have any rights because they're a woman? Does a person have any rights because they're gay? Or does a person have rights because they're a human being? Ultimately, we are all human beings and are therefore entitled to the same rights. To divide people according to race or sex is racist or sexist. Another major difference between the right-wing progressives of Teddy Roosevelt and the left-wing progressives of Bernie Sanders or AOC applies to foreign policy. Being similar to Teddy Roosevelt's, Trump's foreign policy is something we haven't seen in a long time. In my mind, it is the greatest accomplishment of his first term. Even the left wing gives Trump a lot of credit in foreign policy. For example, Trump's actions resulted in a far more peaceful relationship with North Korea, and many support his hostility towards the Chinese government and the corporations who chased our jobs overseas. I don't think anyone would argue that Trump isn't imperial in nature, and accordingly has an imperial foreign policy. Yet most also realize that his foreign policy is not only different, but also much better than the foreign policy of previous administrations. His foreign policy is quite similar to the foreign policy of Teddy Roosevelt, though a bit different. Teddy Roosevelt had the foreign policy best summarized by the phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick, while Trump's foreign policy can be better described as speak loudly and carry a big stick. I think this is reflective of the times we live in, and because previous administrations have sold us out to China. Trump needed to speak loudly to show the American people the dangers that China poses. Regardless of speaking loudly or speaking softly, the ultimate issue is who that stick is used on. While there's some disagreements I have with Trump on some things in foreign policy, particularly Iran, the point that's being made is when imperialism is used for good, it is good and is far superior to the non-interventionism or isolationism of the so-called progressive Democrats. The relationship between China and America is far more important than Iran. Trump recognizes not only the flagrant abuses of human rights in China, but the threat that they pose to America. And just yesterday, Trump fired several Pentagon officials because he's going to withdraw all the troops out of Afghanistan before Christmas. If Joe Biden takes office and wants an endless war, he will have to redeploy them. In my mind, Trump's foreign policy is proof that Trump is the president that America needs. Unlike Obama, who promised to withdraw, Trump actually is going to keep his promises to the American people. So, as you can see, the Republican Party under Trump is becoming similar to the first progressive movement under Teddy Roosevelt. Yes, there's room for a shift in certain policies. One key area should be in environmental policy by putting out a plan that actually addresses climate change, but is also low on regulations, pro-business, pro-American, and with a foreign policy that limits Chinese pollution. With a plan like that, we could attract millions to the movement and would only lose a few, if any. This will make the movement even stronger for 2024. Sound like a pipe dream? Well, I have such a plan and we'll be releasing it very soon. I was planning on putting it out a little earlier, but, well, the elections. That's all the time I have for today. If you like this video, please show your support by subscribing. Thanks for your time.